Hello again. I'm going to talk about functions. Functions, in my considered opinion, should only do one thing at one level of abstraction. This is a habit I've developed over the years, so it doesn't take me any effort really at all to do this. It's just the way I think. So let's take a look at this class that I made called Test Register Local. And I'm just going to scroll through here. Don't bother trying to understand anything or even read any of the text. Just notice how long these functions are. I'm talking 5 to 20 lines of code. Another thing to notice, each function only has one, at most one for loop in it. Because if you think about it, running through a for loop or a while loop is doing one thing. So I always encapsulate those into a function. Here I have some nested ifs, but they're nested in there. It's not like I have a whole bunch of if then else blocks followed by a whole bunch of other if then else blocks in these functions. Now, one of the great things about functions that are smaller is that they're less confusing to look at. They're easier to maintain. You, later on, or a future maintainer can come here and just have nice little small granular pieces of logic to look at. If they're only doing one thing, they're easier to name because it's easier to come up with a name for something that's doing just something simple rather than something that's doing 12 things. This file here, it's just got a lot of really clean code. Not a lot of really deep nested things, not an if, generally, because that usually winds up being baked into smaller functions as well. But I'm not perfect. I sometimes get loose with this, or as code evolves and additional things have to be added into functions, I get a little loose. And so I'm going to show you some examples. Here's an example of a function that almost doesn't fit on my screen with my current font size. And that's another rule of thumb I have. It's like if I'm looking at a function, I don't want to scroll around looking through it. I just want to see the whole thing there. And so here it's almost to the edge. But notice, at some point I started putting comments in here, run the scene, save info to register. So what I'm doing here is there's part of my subconscious is trying to tell me these should be functions. But it's not telling me that loud enough to convince me to not just put in a comment line that says what those lines are doing. An important skill in software development is to be able to be down at the lowest level thinking through things, but every once raise yourself up to a more abstract level and think bigger picture. And if you can go up and down and up and down and up and down, you can realize things like, oh, this should be more than one function if I want to make it cleaner. But sometimes when you're just in there and you just never want to spend the time to do the refactoring, to break them into functions, sometimes things kind of like wind up like this. Here's another example. Show details report for scene type. Here we have comments that really should be function names. Fine. Why am I saying this? Well, this may not be intuitive, but I'm going to show you a case we had on this one project where we had a very brilliant PhD student who solo coded one of the systems and it worked very well. It was of the 3 sub projects, it scored the highest on the evaluations. It was really good, except that it was a complete spaghetti mess. Let me show you here. So here's one function called run scene. How many lines of code is it? Do, 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 do. For you Jeopardy fans. Do, 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 do. There we go. Around 480 lines. As soon as it came time for him to leave the project and somebody new to come on, that's when I looked at this code and I said, oh no. And so I had 3-hour-long interviews with him for him to explain what was going on. That's your first. So I just put comments everywhere. It didn't help that English was his second language and he wasn't super fluent. And so his naming of things was very confusing as well. That definitely did not help. Every time a new student would rotate into this project, they would encounter this pile of code that they could not comprehend. It would take them weeks or months to get enough traction in it to be able to make changes. It was just horrifying experience for them. Very, very painful. But the changes that they were making were perceived to be subtle changes by the person running the project. And so that person would never allow them to take the time to rewrite it from scratch, which was what was needed, or rewrite substantial parts of it from scratch. So student after student hit this. Finally, in the final round of evaluations, changes need to be made that couldn't be made with this code. And substantial portions of it had to be rewritten. And of course, after it was rewritten, it was better. But boy, was that a maintenance nightmare for students who were hoping to come into a situation and have a particular experience, and all they hit was a maintenance problem that could have been avoided if the software was written with better decomposition, smaller functions, better naming, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my most recent experience with the pain caused by this. So, but let's take a look at this function here and just see how it doesn't how it goes against my habits here. So we have obviously big while loop here. We have an if else there. We have an if there. Lots of nested, very deep if blocks. So if you wind up like scrolling here, I'm like, okay, what is similarity index? How does that play in? Wait, where am I? What? I mean, okay, I'm in this, but where is that? What? It's just hopeless. Perhaps there are a couple of people that might be brilliant enough to be able to handle this with some facility. I was certainly not one of those, and none of the students were either. It was really difficult to get traction. Okay, I think that's probably all I'm going to say. Let me see if there's any other wisdom here. No, I think I've covered that pretty well. So be kind to future developers, especially because that future developer might be yourself, and make your functions do one thing at one level of abstraction.